It's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Rena Fender, Holocaust survivor, here to Hopedale for the third time. We're very grateful to have her here today, and I know you guys will be too after you hear her story. She's going to reserve the last probably 10 or so minutes for questions. So I'm going to have to repeat some of the questions for her. I'll come back up so that she can hear what some of you are saying. So I'll kind of be the go-between at that point, okay? So it's my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Rena Fender.
Good afternoon. And can you all hear me? Yes. Good. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here and to see all of you. It's an honor and my pleasure to be able to share my story with all of you beautiful kids, because it is very important for somebody like me who is a survivor. I am a survivor not just of the Holocaust, but I'm a survivor because of Oskar Schindler, who saved me and my mother and my grandfather and 1,000 of other Jewish people. And I feel that I am an eyewitness. And unfortunately, since the war ended 72 years ago, there are very few eyewitnesses left. And so those of us who are still around, we feel very strongly that we need to pass the torch of memory to the future generations, to students like you. Someday, you are going to be in charge of the world. And we're not living in a very good world right now. And you have the power to make a difference. Each and every one of you can make changes because you are all very smart. And as you get older, you're going to be able to vote. If you see something you don't like, you can write a letter to the president, the vice president, your congressman. When you see somebody in your school or anywhere else attacking a younger kid or a younger person, you will not want to say, oh, it's not happening to me, I don't have to do anything, and go by. That's what the bystanders did. That's what people did when the World War II started. The whole world went deaf and blind and didn't care and didn't pay attention to the cruelties done by other human beings against innocent human beings. You have to be, and I know you will be, an upstander. You know, there is so much bullying I hear about, and it's happening. And you know, a bully is a coward. A coward who will only attack somebody who is younger and smaller and weaker. You're not going to stand by and do nothing. You get help. I also think sometimes, how does it feel when a new student walks into a school where people have been together for so many years? It must be so frightening. Imagine it takes just a second to go over and say hi and make somebody feel at home and make another student happy. It is easy to be kind. It's much easier to be kind than to hate. I think that hate is one of the worst emotions that exist, because people who hate don't know anything else. They don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they just know how to hate. And that's such a waste of time. So I want to share with you what it was like when I was little. I was born and I grew up in a beautiful city of Krakow in Poland. I hope sometimes when you grow older, you may go to visit. A lot of schools are actually taking their students to Poland and to different concentration camps to know the story. And I'm an only child, and I lived with my parents in a beautiful apartment house, in a beautiful apartment, right next to an ancient castle that was built in 7th century, where the kings used to live, and right across the river. so that in wintertime, when the river froze, I was able to go skating. And in the summertime, all I had to do was just cross the street, and there was the river, and I could go swimming. I had a great, wonderful, extended family. My father was one of 6 brothers and a sister. And my mother was also, she had 4 brothers and 2 sisters. And it was a wonderful life because everybody loved everybody else. Now, in Poland, unfortunately, there was a great anti-Semitism, and that was allowed by the church and by the government. So we're very lucky that we live in this day and age where people are learned not to hate other people because of their religion or the color of their skin. I didn't know that much about it because I really didn't have that many friends that were not Jewish. I went to a school around the corner from my house, and this was an all-girls school. That's how it used to be in those days. And all the other girls were not Jewish. There were a few Jewish girls. So I remember the first day of school, it was kindergarten, when I went to play at recess time, and with all the other girls, and I was having a great time, when all of a sudden one of the little girls picked up a stone and threw it at me, and she said, "You dirty Jew." And I came home, I was so shocked. I said to my mom, "Why did she call me dirty? I just took a shower this morning." And my mom tried to explain to me that some people are just not very nice. And I remember she said to me, "Not everybody's gonna like you, and you're not gonna like everybody." And that was her explanation, because how else can you explain to a 6-year-old, and I don't even think I was 6 already, how can you explain that somebody hates you even if they don't know you and you didn't do anything? And all those things had changed on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. So overnight, from being a little girl, I became an enemy of the state. Because Germany has decided that Jewish people were inhuman, that Jewish people were worse than the cockroaches and bedbugs and rats, and that everything that happens that is bad, if they lost the First War, if people didn't have jobs, if they didn't have enough money, if maybe they got divorced or they went out of business, it was all the fault of the Jews. Now, in Germany, there was 1% of Jewish people, and in Poland, the Jewish people in Poland lived in Poland for centuries, and we were very, very patriotic. My father and his brothers and my grandfather, my mother's brothers, they all fought for the independence of Poland. We were very patriotic, but those people did not care. And sometimes I wonder about Adolf Hitler, because Hitler wanted to have an Aryan race. Everybody was supposed to be blonde and blue-eyed. The picture of Jewish people, that was the propaganda against the Jewish people, also showed people that had big crooked noses and black hair and really were ugly. Well, in reality, of course, it's like everywhere else. Some people are very good looking and some people may not be that good looking. But we still all the same. I always thought about Germany and the people who lived there as very cultured people, very well educated, very famous for the writers, its composers. And they were ordinary people, the people you come across every day. They were teachers and lawyers and doctors and plumbers, electricians and bricklayers, and they were human beings like all of us. They were sons and fathers and husbands and brothers, ordinary people. And I remember watching this mighty German army march into Krakow, and we're standing on a sidewalk, and I look at them. They were scary looking because they had such a modern equipment. Their uniforms, their boots, their cars, their rifles. The Polish army reminded me very much of the army of 1776. They didn't have enough uniforms, they didn't have enough horses, they certainly didn't have enough rifles. And my father was very optimistic. My father said, don't worry, the world will hear what's happening and they will come and save us. Because the first thing that the Germans did when they settled on the Wawel in that beautiful ancient castle, and they started to govern, the first thing they did, they took all civil rights away from the Jewish people. So like again, overnight from being a little girl, I am an enemy of the state. We were not allowed to go to school anymore. We were not allowed to own businesses. The Jewish businesses were confiscated, were taken away from the Jewish people. Our bank accounts were confiscated. We were told that we had to wear an armband, a white armband with a blue Star of David. And we were told that we were going to have to get a permit to remain in Krakow. That anybody under 12 and anybody over 55 would not be allowed to remain in Krakow. We were told those people will be sent to the farms to help the farmer grow food for the German army. Well, I was only 10, but I was lucky I was tall for my age. So my parents were able to falsify my birth certificate and make me 2 years older. And I remember that I went with my parents to obtain the permit in front of the building where the Gestapo was and all the Nazis. And I remember standing in line in a big square in front of this big building, and we were surrounded for what seemed to me like were hundreds and hundreds of Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, revolvers, and dogs, huge dogs. They were muzzled, and they were barking and growling, and they were actually trained to tear people apart. And I remember one of the soldiers was standing maybe 10 feet away from me and was threatening me that he's going to let the dog jump on me. And I was so scared. And yet, while we were in the middle of the square, just across the street, the Polish people, they were occupied, but they were not enslaved. And people were going around their business. Kids were going to school. People were going to work. There was even a streetcar that ran by all around us. And you know, people didn't see us. People didn't hear us. It was like we did not exist. You know, to this day, when I think about it, I feel betrayed because I felt that we didn't deserve it. We didn't do anything wrong. My parents and I got a permit to remain in Krakow, but not where we lived. Now, Krakow at that time had about 250,000 residents, and probably about 50,000 were Jews. No, not even that, I think. And we were told that we were going to be put into the ghetto. Now, what is a ghetto? The ghetto was just part of the city. It was the old part of the city, over the river. And it was an area where there were about 12,000 people living there. And all of a sudden, they started to build a wall around an area of the city that was supposed to house about 35,000 people. And we were told that we had about, I think, a week or two, I don't remember exactly, to pack up, get ready. We were not allowed to take much with us. My father was able to get a pushcart, and we loaded some pots and pans, some linen, and some blankets and pillows. I remember it was in March, and it was very cold, and we put a lot of layers of clothing. I remember that my parents told me to put my ski boots on and a small suitcase, and we had to leave. I think that we had to be out by 12 o'clock to turn the key into the superintendent of the building. And I stood in my bedroom, and I looked at all the things that were mine. I used to love to read, so I had a lot of books. And I also loved Shirley Temple dolls. Now, you probably, did anybody hear about the Shirley Temple? Well, when I was little, when I was young, there was a very famous movie actress. She was the same age as me. She was adorable, and she was as popular as any of the dolls are now, the American dolls and all such things. And my mom said, well, you can't take it with you because there is no room for it. I remember as we started to leave our apartment, on every floor, we lived on a third floor, I tried to say goodbye to some of my neighbors. I was very friendly with my neighbors. But I rang the doorbell, and nobody was home. And as we started to walk away from the building, and I turned around to take one last look, and I saw all my neighbors behind closed windows, behind the lacy curtains, watching us leave, but nobody had the guts to say goodbye. And as we walked through the narrow street of my beloved city, there were young people lined up all over, and they were throwing mud at us, and they were saying, good riddance, don't ever come back. And then we came through the gates of the ghetto. The ghetto was like about 3 blocks long and 1 avenue wide. And there was a lot of police. There was the Polish police, there was the Jewish Ordnungsdienst, which means that they were supposed to keep order, made sure everybody was walking where they were supposed to. And there were barbed wire on top of the wall, a brick wall. And I remember we walked to the building we were assigned. And it was a very old building. It was so old that the bathrooms were outside in a hall, so that all the residents had to share about the bathrooms. And we walked into the small, tiny kitchen on a 4th floor. And it was so tiny that I remember I looked at the sink. Just before the war started, I was able to see the movie Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. And I looked at the little kitchen sink. It was very low and very small. And I remember I told my mom, look, it looks like it belonged to the movie. And then we walked into the bedroom, the first bedroom. There were already a family, 2 families living there, actually. And then the second bedroom, there was already 1 family of 3. And my mom and my dad, I remember, they put hooks on each side of the wall. They put a rope and to divide us. And my father said, don't worry, because when the world outside will hear what's happening, they will come and save us. In the ghetto, everybody was going to be employed. The people that owned businesses, different businesses before the war, were told to create workshops so that everybody would be employed. And we were slaves. And we were going to be working very hard to make those over us to be so happy with our hard work that they wouldn't want to kill us, we hoped. I went to work in a printing shop. There were so many different shops. There was a farrier shops and tailors and dressmakers and shoemakers. And people were making brushes and brooms. Everybody was busy. It was like we worked 12 hours a day, 1 week during the day, and then the following week the shifts changed and the day shift would go on a night shift. And we saw the harder we work, the more money the Germans would make, and they're going to let us live. But we were so naive because we still believe in humanity, because the Germans did not want to see us alive. And every night and during the day, there were guards all over the place. They would either grab people out, put them in the square. There was a square in the ghetto. And when it was full of people, they would send them away, and we never heard from them. Or sometimes at night. And sometimes if they didn't like somebody for whatever reason, they would just kill the people as they were walking or working. But my father was still very optimistic. And I remember one day my mom told me that I had to hide with my grandparents. And it was since we lived in this big building, there was a huge courtyard with a mountain of dirt. And my mom said we should climb in, crawl in. She was going to cover us, and she had to go to work. And I remember laying inside that huge mountain of dirt. We're laying on our stomach, and I felt the ground shaking. The trucks carrying the soldiers were coming in. It was very early in the morning, and the soldiers running with their boats were running through the streets of the empty ghetto, and I thought it was an earthquake. I remember they ran through the courtyard, up and down in the apartment buildings, looking for people who were hiding. I could hear the shots, and I thought that we would be next. And it seemed like an eternity that we lay there, afraid to breathe. When finally we could hear the soldiers leaving, I could hear them shooting when they found some people in hiding. And finally they were leaving. And I could hear them. I could feel that they were sticking the rifles inside the mountain of that. I was sure they would find us. For some reason, luckily, they didn't have the dogs that day. And finally, my mom came, and she told us to come out, and she was helping us to clean up. I had pine needles and all kind of dirt in my hair, and I was trying to clean up. And all of a sudden, we came face to face with the last patrol of the day. They were young boys. They were maybe 18, 20 years old. And we were lucky in a way. They took my grandparents away, and because they didn't have the papers, but I had papers and so did my mom. So even though it was so obvious that we were trying to hide with them, they didn't kill us, and they walked away. I was very close with my grandparents. And I remember my grandmother walking away. They were holding hands with she and my grandfather, and she whispered, don't worry, we'll be okay. I never saw them again. About a few weeks later, they came that dreaded knock on our doors at the middle of the night, and my father was arrested. My father was accused of being part of the resistance. That was not true. I don't know who said it, so I had my suspicion later on, but I never saw my father again. And then one day, just the way you will see, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie. Have anybody seen the movie Schindler's List? Well, I hope you will see the movie, those of you who didn't, but I want you to know that everything in that movie is really the truth. Everything in that movie is what happened to me. It was my life and the life of the 1,000 people that Oskar Schindler saved. Oskar Schindler, you see, was a very young, handsome man who was very ambitious. He was born in Czechoslovakia, but he was German. And before the war started, he was just a salesman selling farm equipment and wasn't making much money. He wasn't very happy. He was actually one of the first to join the Nazi Party. He had a wonderful personality, and he became very friendly with some of the high-ranking generals and also some politicians. Before the war, when he was doing business, he used to come to Krakow often. He was very familiar with the city. So when the Germans took over Krakow, he came in and was looking for a place where he could make a lot of money. He got a factory called Emalia. The factory before the war was making pots and pans. When Oskar Schindler took over the factory, he didn't know anything about how to run the business. So for him, the Jewish people who worked there became his friends. You see, even though he was a member of the Nazi Party and wore this huge swastika on his lapel, his heart did not have hate for the Jewish people. He just wanted to be rich. He just wanted to make a lot of money, and he did. He got a beautiful apartment. He was able to buy a lot of horses, a lot of cars. And in order to do that, of course, he was very friendly with all those so-called friends. He was bribing them. He was drinking with them, entertaining them. He never got drunk. He gambled with them. He always lost. He was buying them expensive gifts on a black market where they wouldn't know how to go about getting it, and they wouldn't want to spend the money. So for them, Oskar Schindler was their best friend. And Oskar Schindler, when he realized what the Germans had in mind for us, he decided that he doesn't want to have any part of that. You see, Oskar Schindler was like the only one who stood up and said, I am not going to stand by and watch innocent people murdered. I'll do everything I can to help. Because you see, everybody else said, there is nothing I can do. So all those people, millions and millions and millions of people, stood behind closed windows and became deaf and dumb and not listening and not knowing, but most of all, not caring about what was happening to people, innocent people. The time came when Amon Get, one of the worst, horrible, more sadistic human being or inhuman beings that ever lived, was chosen to be in charge of liquidating the ghetto and creating a concentration camp. Now, when we heard that Amon Get was from Vienna, we said, ooh, Vienna. After all, we all again heard about Vienna, full of its famous people, very cultured people. As a matter of fact, his family supposedly was in a publishing business, and they were very respected, and we thought he's going to be good. Well, of course, we were wrong, because Amon Get loved the killing of human beings. He went hunting for people. The concentration camp Plaszow was being built about 5 kilometers outside of the Krakow ghetto, on a small village called Plaszow. There were like 2 Jewish cemeteries there. So you can't even imagine what happens when the cemeteries are leveled and the tombstones are broken and they start to build barracks on it. All the people from the ghetto had to go and build. The men were building the barracks and the women were building the road. By the time that things were almost ready, the ghetto was going to be liquidated. And we were told again that anybody under 12, anybody over 55, had to remain in the ghetto, and the rest could go to the camp. My mom and I were taking care of my little cousin, Jenny. Jenny was blonde and blue-eyed. Her parents and her older sister, who was my age, were taken away, and it was at the time when my father was still with us. And he was able to grab Jenny and bring her, and we took care of her, my mom and I, after my father was gone. I tried to take Jenny with me when I was supposed to walk through the gate and join the group from the printing shop. And I was not allowed. They told me to go back and leave her in the orphan's home. And I was happy, because in the orphan's home there were a lot of children. There were children whose parents were taken away, and they were brought into the ghetto, into the orphan's home. And we knew that the orphans, especially in Poland, would be taken care of by the nuns. So while I hated to leave her, she was beautiful. She was such a beautiful little girl. Just as beautiful as each and every one is now and was when you were little. When you think about Adolf Hitler with his black hair and with the black mustache, I see him sometimes walking and yelling and screaming, and I look at him and I think, why, he looks more Jewish than any Jew I knew. He certainly was not the idea of what he wanted everyone else to be, blonde and blue-eyed. So how is it possible? Because to this day, I don't think anybody can have an answer. How can a man like that inspire to hate millions and millions and millions of people? It's unthinkable. Unthinkable then and unthinkable now. People could not imagine what was going to happen because it was beyond imagination. I remember as I was starting to walk out from the ghetto with a group of the workers from the printing shop, some of the people in that group, they had their little children in their backpack, and the children were drugged so they wouldn't cry, they wouldn't move. Those were the lucky people who had some Aryan friends, some Polish friends, those we called the righteous Gentiles. Those were people that were going to hide a Jewish child or a Jewish family, and those were the people who risked their lives and the lives of their family, not just because of the Germans, of the Gestapo, but because of their neighbor. If their neighbor would suspect anyone of hiding a Jew, he would report them to the authorities for a bag of potatoes, for a loaf of bread, and really just for the satisfaction of getting rid of the Jews. You see, there was no help coming from anywhere. And when people say we didn't know, it's a lie. Everybody knew. Everybody knew. The ghetto was in the middle of the city. If you lived in a city and you walked by, or the streetcar went by, you knew where you were. How could you not know? If people were in villages near the concentration camps, there is no way they didn't know. They saw the poor people walk by, the prisoners in their prisoner uniforms. They saw them, but they didn't see them. When we walked into the Plaszów camp, I remember how scared I was. We couldn't take much with us. Again, a tiny suitcase with a little bit of clothing. I remember in the barracks, we didn't have a bunk bed. We had what we call shelves. Because most of you, I know you read the book Night, and you saw probably the pictures, and you know what it looks like. It was hell. It was impossible. You couldn't live. There was not enough water. There was not enough electricity. It was hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. And we were told to call to the roll call every morning and every night. And we stood there sometimes for hours. Do you know that even though I saw Amon Ged every single day at least twice, I always made sure that I don't make eye contact with him. Because I always felt if he doesn't see me, then he can't kill me. Because whenever he walked, death was walking behind him. He always had a weapon. And every morning he would get up very early. And he would stand on the balcony and watch the people going back and forth to work. And for no reason, he would kill. He was hunting for people. One of his first victims was actually my father's younger brother, my Uncle Roman, who was in charge of a group that was painting the barracks. He just shot him for no reason. My mom and I were lucky. We were lucky because we heard that Oskar Schindler, who became Amon Ged's best friend because he needed him, made a deal with Amon Ged that he wanted to build a camp next to his factory because he didn't want to waste the time of the people walking back and forth. And he wanted more people, especially women. He wanted 150 more women, especially youngs with skinny fingers. And so my mom and I were lucky enough to live and go to work for Oskar Schindler, which was like escaping from hell. Hell and the devil, Amon Ged, and go to heaven to work for Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler's barracks were much smaller. We actually had bunk beds. Oskar Schindler was using his own money to support, to buy food for his workers. I went to work on a lace machine. I was making shells for ammunition. Every morning, Oskar Schindler would come in and praise us. All the young people were doing it, and I was very good on it. I was working so fast and doing so well that one of the German foremen came over and told me to go to the bigger machine. That machine is actually on a movie, it's a press. And it was always breaking. So I was on it maybe for 3 hours and the machine broke. And the foreman started yelling at me that I committed sabotage. And he was going to call the guards to come and get me. And he said, they're going to kill you. Because you see, the guards in Oskar Schindler's factory, in Oskar Schindler camp, were not allowed to be there. They were on the outsides watching, making sure we didn't escape. But they were not allowed inside. It never happened anywhere else but for Oskar Schindler. And somebody called for Oskar Schindler. I remember he came down. I remember him like it was yesterday. I was working in the part of a factory that was making ammunition. And he wanted to know what was going on. And the foreman was yelling. He said, look, she broke the machine. And then Oskar Schindler turned and started to yell at the foreman. He said, how can a little girl with little hands break this big machine? And he gave orders that from then on, only men were allowed to work on that machine. Unfortunately, our good life didn't last very long because Germans were losing the war against the Allies, but they were determined to win the war against the Jews. And so orders came that all the concentration camps inside Poland and Czechoslovakia were going to be confiscated. They were going to be closed down and go march into Germany. And that's when Oskar Schindler made his famous deal with Amon Get. He bribed him with a fortune of diamonds and was going to move his factory to Brnice, Czechoslovakia, where he came from. And so the women were 300 women by that time. We were tattooed with KL, which in German stands for concentration lager. But the doctors, the Jewish doctors, never did that kind of work before, so they didn't do a very good job. So the tattoo of KL on the arms of the Schindler's worker disappeared after the war, unlike those of all the other Jewish men and women and children who were tattooed in Auschwitz or Gross-Rosen with a number on the arm. They go to their grave now with the number on their arm. And I'm sure there must be a special place in heaven waiting for them. I remember that the women were taken first, and we were loaded into cars, into boxcars, worse than animals. The animals, when they would be in cars, they were getting food and air and water. We were not getting food, no water, no bathroom facilities, no air. I remember we were standing for a long, long time before the train started to move. And some of the women were fainting, but they couldn't fall down. We were squeezed like sardines. And when the train finally moved, somehow we had bad feeling. We didn't know where we were going. We were supposed to go to Czechoslovakia, to Brnice, to the new factory, where we would live next to the factory, work for Oskar Schindler. And the train finally stopped, and the doors opened. It was midnight. A lot of women were unconscious. And I remember that the light shone, a spotlight shone on the trains. And I remember seeing miles and miles of barbed wires. And I saw what seemed like hundreds and hundreds of SS soldiers with those dogs, huge dogs that bark. And I saw a sign that said Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then we knew that the rumors we heard about Auschwitz-Birkenau was true. We heard about it, but we didn't believe it. How could anybody believe in the 20th century there are people who built special equipment for murdering innocent people, where they bring the gas chambers and crematorium to kill hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people a day that were not criminals, they were human beings. Our only fault was that we were Jewish. I remember when we were helped to go out of the train because we could barely walk. And there was a terrible stench in Auschwitz. You know, Auschwitz was a huge place. There was Auschwitz I, where before the war actually housed the Polish army. And Auschwitz I was where the Germans kept their prisoners of war, political prisoners, religious prisoners, people who were gay, some gypsies. But it was only to Auschwitz-Birkenau when all the Jewish people were brought to be killed. All the Jews were victims. There were some victims that were not Jewish, but the majority was Jews. And I remember the guards yelling and screaming for us to run, and we were running. I remember there was a terrible stench in Auschwitz, and we thought it was snowing. So we were hoping to catch some of the snowflakes. But when you reach out, those were no snowflakes. Those were ashes. The families of the guards who work in Auschwitz, they complained to the visitors from Berlin that they couldn't hang out their clothes outside, and they couldn't let their children play outside because of the ashes and the stench. We had no idea what was happening, but we were beaten by the soldiers and told to run. And I remember because it was night, and it was November, and it was cold, but I remember seeing ahead of me something that looked like chimneys. And so it was dark. I could see some fire, and I could see the smoke coming out of the chimneys. I didn't believe what I was saying. I didn't know what it was for. How could you? It was impossible. It was impossible to believe. It was impossible that you actually saw what you really saw. Finally, we came to stop in the front of a big barrack, and there were a lot of officers, Nazi officers, especially one I remember, with a whip in his hand. He sent some people to the left, some people to the right, and we realized those going to the left were women that could barely walk. And so I tried to straighten out, pinch our cheeks so we would look good. We were told to strip from head to bottom and stood in line. It was a huge barrack. There was nothing there but a bench all around the wall. We were told to fold our clothes and leave it, that we'll come back for it. And then ahead of us, there were some soldiers and some prisoners, and they were shaving everyone's head. And we were shaved from head to bottom. And I remember that, of course, those people didn't have the right instruments, and they really didn't know what they were doing. And I remember how it hurt when they were pulling our hair and they were cutting the hair. And I remember that I was shaking. I was shaking because I was so scared. Finally, they told us that we shouldn't be afraid, we were going for the showers. And they pushed us into the dark room, just the way you'll see it in the movie, or you saw it in the movie already. And I looked at my mom, and I didn't recognize anyone. The lights came on, and the water came down. And I looked at the people I knew I worked with for the last 3 years. I didn't recognize them. And I said to my mom, you see, now that we are dead already, now we don't have to worry anymore. We're not going to suffer anymore, we're dead. And my mom said, no, we are alive. And I felt when they cut my hair, when they shaved my hair, I felt so totally dehumanized and so traumatized. I couldn't be alive anymore. When I was little, I had long braids. When I went into the ghetto, my mother had my braids cut to have my hair shorter, and I remember my father cried. And my mom said it would be easier to take care of it. And all the time while we were in the ghetto and in the camps, we still cared about our hair. What do girls do when they wake up in the morning? What do you do first? You go, you brush your teeth, and then you comb your hair, right? And then you make sure that you blow it, that you curl it, whatever you want to do. Whether you are a man, or when you're a girl or a boy, you don't want anybody to shave your hair, even though some people like it. Well, that's fine, but if you don't like it. And I remember when the water stopped, we were cold, and they pushed us to the other room, and there were women as guards, and they were vicious. So we had to quickly grab whatever we could. There was a pile of wooden shoes, and when you put a wet foot in a wooden shoe, right away you get blisters. And there was a pile of clothing. At the time, I think they didn't give any more uniform. And I remember everybody was pulling something because the SS women guards were beating us. And so I grabbed something that I saw maybe it was mine. Just before I was going into 5th grade, before the war started, my mom allowed me. She took me to buy a fabric that I liked, and she took me to a dressmaker to make a dress I liked. You see, before the war, you could not, there was no places like Macy's or Con. You could not buy clothes, you had to have it made. And I loved that dress, that yellow dress with the red peonies. And so I pulled up something, and it was a chiffon dress that must have belonged to a very old, big fat lady. And I had to wrap it around me 10 times so I wouldn't trip. It was November, it was very cold, I was wet, I put on a chiffon dress. And they pushed us to the other side of the barrack, and we stood there in Auschwitz-Birkenau, which words cannot describe, because there are no words in any language, as Elie Wiesel have said. If you were not there, you cannot imagine. I was there, and I couldn't imagine. We were pushed into a barrack that didn't even have any shelves to sleep on. We slept on the floor. Every morning and every night, we stood in front of the barrack to be counted. The women in charge of the barrack were Hungarian. We didn't speak Hungarian, and they didn't speak Polish or German, so we never knew what they wanted. One day, standing in front of the barrack while they were counting us, one of them slapped my friend who was in front of me and told her, "Stop talking." And it was at this point, stupidly, I said she was not talking. And she came at me and was ready to slap me. Said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Well, she wasn't talking." So she said, "Apologize to me." I said, "No, she wasn't talking." So it seemed unbelievable to me then that I did that. And when I think of it now, I still can't believe that I did that. But I think there was a point when I didn't care. I couldn't take it anymore. And I wanted to be me, speaking up for my friend. So they pushed me back into the barrack, and they told me to kneel. The barrack had a long brick chimney from one side and another. Of course, it was never hot. And I kneeled there for the rest of the day, and I wouldn't apologize. So finally, when it was time to come out for the roll call again, the other eldest, that they called her, the other woman in charge, said to me to go out because we had to be counted. And if I was missing, then everybody would be killed. We were so lucky because the women on Schindler's List were in Auschwitz for 3.5 weeks. That's a long time to be in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you get no food, where you work outside when you freezing weather and you're not dressed warm enough. And then Oskar Schindler bribed the commander of Auschwitz to let his women go. And so we were lucky enough that we left. And on the train, this time we were not packed like sardines. We were able to sit. And when the doors opened, and there stood Oskar Schindler in all his glory. I will never forget him. This is green Tyrolean hat with the green Tyrolean coat. And he said, I will take care of you. I have food for you. And he did. The last 7 months of the war, when hundreds and thousands of Jewish people were put on a death march in the worst winter of the 20th century, people either froze to death overnight, couldn't walk anymore and they were killed, or just walked and fell off because they couldn't do it anymore. Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945. The war didn't end till May 1945. All those months, millions of people died. Those of us on Schindler's List were saved because of Oskar Schindler. And that's why we who are still alive, the survivors and the liberators, the young GIs who after fighting the most horrible war came across places they never expected and they couldn't imagine. They came across people that looked like they were corpses. Many were, some looked like it. They shared their rations with those who liberated, and they had to go on. They still had to go on to Berlin. They still had a war to fight. And they never, never spoke about it. It's only the last few years that some of the veterans, some of the liberators, want to share their stories because they feel that they were eyewitnesses. Because there are still some deniers of the Holocaust. There are still people who say it didn't happen. And that's why it is so important to talk about it. John F. Kennedy, at his inaugural address, he said, whether you are black and white or yellow, whether your hair is blonde or red, when you cut your finger, your blood is red. If you can look at another human being as a human being, no matter what color he is, what religion they are, then it is up to you. You are the future. You can do. You can make a good decision. You can show a kind heart. And I'm sure you will. And when my mom and I, after the liberation, when we went back to Krakow, we found that my father, his brothers, his parents, my mother's parents, her brothers, her sisters, my little cousins, my friends, did not survive. My mom and I were alone with hundreds of other people who came after the war to look for their relatives and found them gone. That's why I feel that how can you thank a man for saving your life? There are no ways. The only way I can do it for Oskar Schindler to talk about him. And this is why it's so important for young people like you to fight against bigotry and racism and hate.
Thank you. Michael. He wants to know how you came to America after the Holocaust.
That's a very good question. We came after the war. We lived in Austria because we lived in displaced person camps. Because being Polish Jews, we had no state to go to. The Polish people still did not like the Jewish people to come back. So we lived in the displaced person camps that was supported by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Organization and by a lot of Jewish organizations. And we had a professor that was teaching girls my age who never went above the 4th grade. We had a lot to learn, and I got married. I had a friend who had an uncle who sent papers for them to come and sent papers for us to come. My husband and me came to the United States. We were the first ship with survivors of the Holocaust that came to Boston. And we stayed in Massachusetts and started to live again a normal life with no hate I didn't want to hate. I just wanted to live like a human being again.
Matt? He wants to know if you had any communication with Oskar Schindler after the Holocaust.
You know, because we were in Boston, in Massachusetts, I never saw him after the war. What he did after the war, Oskar Schindler was treated like a traitor in Germany. So he and Mrs. Schindler, who came to Emalia factory in Brinitz, they went to Argentina with the help of Jewish organizations, and he didn't like it there. So he went back to Germany and had to fight for his pension. Now the SS, the killers, didn't have to fight for their pension. Oskar Schindler, because he saved the Jews, was considered a traitor and they didn't want him. When he started to visit he called us his children. But when he was in the beginning, when he started to come, when he was in New York, I couldn't afford to go. I had three little kids and not much money. So I always felt next year. Well, unfortunately, Oskar Schindler died very young, and he was supported by his children, as he called all of us, and he requested to be buried in Jerusalem. And there were 4,000 people the first time he came to visit Israel, all as he called us, his children. I wish I wish he didn't die so young. I wish that he lived to see the movie. He would have loved Steven Spielberg. We all love Steven Spielberg because I feel because of Steven Spielberg, there is more awareness about the Holocaust. If somebody else would make a movie, and there were many movies made about the Holocaust before, but people really didn't go. It was in selected movies, theaters, selected times. Not many people went. But Steven Spielberg, of course, being famous, he reached millions of people with this movie, and he sort of broke the wall of silence. All of a sudden, after that movie, it was like legal. It was accepted to say that you are a survivor, and for the liberators to stand up and start talking too.
Okay. Oh, we got a couple more. Jenna. She wants to know if you had any specific memory from the factory that stands out when you worked for Oskar Schindler.
Well, my most important memory is about what happened when they took me away from my little machine and put me on the big machine, and then I was able to go back because of Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler used to come every morning and he would talk to everyone. So he would say, he would say to me, "Wie geht's jetzt, Kleine?" which means, "How you doing, little one?" To us, he was angel of mercy. We felt that somebody sent him down from heaven to take care of us because he was the only one. It took a long time for the people who saved or hid the Jewish people to come up and admit, because they were afraid. They were still afraid of the neighbors would do. Do you know that there are people living now in Poland and maybe Germany who are already 80 years old and are just now finding out that the parents they thought they had were not really their parents, but the people who took them from the parents so the children could survive. Because it was still a stigma to say, I saved a Jewish person or a Jewish child. It's just now that things are beginning to change, only because of the young people. The older people, whether they're German or Polish, they still nurtured the hate. But the younger people, of course, are different. They don't believe in hate.
Okay. I can't see. Is that Nora? Nora. What was the toughest part overall? What was the toughest part?
Every moment was the toughest part. Because every moment where you were, as long as you were in Plaszow and in Auschwitz, you saw people being killed. Only in Brinitz, under Oskar Schindler care, people were not killed. Do you know, in Oskar Schindler's factory, there are only 2 people who died, and they died a normal death. There was an older person who died of a heart attack, and a young girl who died because she had bone cancer. Both of them were buried in a casket, and in a place where after the war, the remaining family was able to take them back to the Jewish cemetery in Prague. Now, that never happened anywhere. If you think of million people, 6 million people that were burned, that were murdered, they didn't have a grave. Because of Oskar Schindler, 2 Jewish people had a grave.
Mrs. Crowell.
Where did you find the strength that hope tomorrow would be a better day?
She said, where
Yeah,
you
I
heard.
know, I had, that is a very, very good question, and it's, you do what you have to do. I was with my mother. I had to make sure that my mother is gonna be okay. I think that you looked when you woke up in the morning and you were still alive. You hoped you'd be alive at night. And when you went to bed at night, you hoped you're gonna wake up alive in the morning. We would never have survived if we were not on Oskar Schindler's list. And people who did survive, mostly those who had somebody else, whether they had a friend or a sister or a mother, it was easier to survive when you had somebody that cared for you. I think that Anne Frank would have survived if her sister didn't die, if there were 2 of them together. Because people died as the Americans or the British marched into camps. People were still dying from malnutrition and horrible diseases. So hope only lasted for a while. Knowing, believing that the war would end was something we didn't dare until it happened.
Okay, how about one more question? Yes. She wants to know what went through your mind when you saw your grandparents and your father taken away.
I was heartbroken, of course, but at the time, I did not believe that they would be killed. I believed that they were going to be in another ghetto or another camp, and I never thought for a moment that they would be dead. Not after the war, when I came back to Krakow, my father, before the war, was a sales manager for a company like Johnson & Johnson in the United States. It was a similar company, and he dealt with drugstores, a lot of drugstores. I went to every pharmacy in Krakow, asking them if they saw my father. I did not believe that my father would be dead. He was young, he was handsome, he was strong. We didn't know about the ovens. We didn't believe in it.
Okay, if anybody wants to come down and meet Mrs. Fender before she leaves, come on down. We're going to have her take a seat over here, and you can come meet her, okay?